Bork said that he had spent his life in intellectual pursuits in the law, and that serving on the Supreme Court would be an intellectual feast. This was an honest answer, and also a disastrous one, confirming the widely held suspicion that Bork was an elitist who did not understand, or care for, the concerns of ordinary Americans, or how those concerns would be addressed in a court of law. The Senate Judiciary Committee, controlled by Democrats, voted against him 9-5. That made the full Senate vote a foregone conclusion. Only 42 members of that chamber would vote for Bork, a major defeat for President Reagan. The question, now, is whether Democrats can do to Kavanaugh what they did to Bork and prevent Republicans from turning the Supreme Court into a conservative redoubt immune, at least until the next vacancy, to changes in prevailing political attitudes. Veterans of the Bork fight say that will be difficult, but not impossible, to accomplish. Mark Gittenstein was chief counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1987, which was chaired at the time by Joe Biden, then a Democratic senator from Delaware. Gittenstein, who later wrote about the Bork nomination in the book Matters of Principle, believes that Democrats can sink Kavanaugh's bid not by focusing on specific issues, access to abortion, for example, or labor rights, both of which Kavanaugh views skeptically, but by depicting him as broadly antithetical to what most Americans stand for. If I were on that committee, I would want to be convinced that Kavanaugh will not be part of a majority which will prohibit a future Democratic Congress and Democratic president from reversing the rollback the Trump administration has undertaken in workers' rights, consumer rights, civil rights, and the environment, Gittenstein told News Pulse News. I fear, he continued, Judge Kavanaugh has a very narrow view of the power of Congress to enact legislation in these fields and of the administrative agencies to implement it. So even if President Trump is rejected by the voters in 2020, he will have installed the critical fifth vote on the Supreme Court that will preserve his legacy for a generation. Efforts to paint Bork as an extremist began less than an hour after Reagan announced the nomination, when Senator Ted Kennedy, the liberal lion from Massachusetts, took to the Senate floor, where he offered a legendarily vivid picture of Bork's America as a land in which women would be forced into back-alley abortions, blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters, rogue police could break down citizens' doors in midnight raids, school children could not be taught about evolution, writers and artists would be censored at the whim of government, and the doors of the federal courts would be shut on the fingers of millions of citizens for whom the judiciary is often the only protector of the individual rights that are the heart of our democracy. That proved a compelling opening shot, but Gittenstein believes that it was Biden's questioning of Bork 2.5 months later that turned the American people against the nominee. In that questioning, Biden clearly established that Bork had a very narrow view of the Constitution and that he did not believe a right, such as the right to privacy, existed unless it was explicitly written into the Constitution, Gittenstein says. Biden was especially effective in teasing out Bork's views on Griswold v. Connecticut, which overturned a state law restricting the use of contraceptives. Bork attempted to stake out a nuanced position, but ended up giving the impression that he would have the state intrude on matters of the bedroom. Nan Aaron, who founded the legal activism group Alliance for Justice, which was among the leaders in the anti-Bork movement, credits Howell Heflin, a conservative Democrat for Alabama, for managing to effectively portray Bork as an elitist. The slow-speaking Southerner noted that Bork had once been fond of socialism and, much more recently, had moderated his extreme positions to make them suitable for a potential Supreme Court nomination. I wish I was a psychiatrist rather than a lawyer and member of this committee to try and figure out what you would do if you get on the Supreme Court, Heflin said devastatingly. He would come to cast a crucial vote against Bork. Whether Democrats can effectively make that argument is the critical question. Aaron of Alliance for Justice says that after Bork, the playbook changed completely, with nominees heavily coached by the nominating party and taught to avoid any controversy by disingenuously alluding to settled law. Kavanaugh has done just that in his not especially reassuring assurances about Roe v. Wade. With Brett Kavanaugh, that playbook is very much in use, Aaron says, with the added page of 100,000 pages of Kavanaugh's records the Trump administration has withheld from scrutiny. Unlike Bork, Kavanaugh is a consummate Washington insider. His father was a cosmetics lobbyist, and he was raised in the Tony inside the Beltway suburb of Bethesda before heading to New Haven. The political game that Bork found so difficult to play comes practically as second nature to Kavanaugh. My sense is that Judge Kavanaugh has paid great attention to preparing for this moment, says Heidi Preem, including his press conference listing the significance of women in his life from his mother, to his wife to his daughters, a reference to the announcement of his nomination at the White House. Kavanaugh opened those remarks by preposterously praising Trump for his respect for the judiciary, and by suggesting that Trump had deliberated more thoroughly in his Supreme Court selection than any president in American history. This show of obsequy may have endeared Kavanaugh to Trump, but it also could harm him with the Senate, which may not look kindly on a nakedly ambitious lickspittle. Democrats are not going to fall for the non-answer, Tandon says, when it comes to Kavanaugh's positions, either on presidential power or contentious issues like the Affordable Care Act and access to legal abortion. One senior advisor to a leading Democrat in the Senate tells Pulse News that staffers have been poring over transcripts of the last 40 years of Supreme Court nominations, trying to learn exactly how such battles are won or lost. In this case, the battle will be won by keeping Midwestern Democrats in line and attracting at least one Republican, probably either Lisa Murkowski of Alaska or Susan Collins of Maine, who are at least nominally supporters of abortion rights. Not an easy task, the staffer acknowledged, but Republicans might be claiming victory a little too soon. And there is, of course, the issue of presidential power. Many believe that Trump selected Kavanaugh based on a 2009 Minnesota Law Review article that seemed to suggest that a sitting president should be protected from prosecution, so as to avoid distracting him from his duties. The president should be excused from some of the burdens of ordinary citizenship while serving in office, Kavanaugh wrote. With his preternaturally acute sense of self-preservation, Trump could have seized on that line. Democrats may well do the same. The candidate is flawed and the process is reprehensible. No one can disagree with that, laments Aaron, who has won and lost plenty of fights in her long career as a judicial activist. With Kavanaugh, as with Bork, there are plenty of arrows in the quill. The question now is who will wield them, and how effectively. All we need, Aaron says, is a few courageous senators. More Pulse News stories on the Supreme Court.